Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Now I have 3 questions.
Yes,
Let's start with the first one.
I'm listening.
What is paranoia?
Let me explain paranoia like this. Since dictionary definitions are usually complicated, we can define it simply like this. As you know, our brain always wants to feel safe. The paranoia part is when the brain does this in an exaggerated way. After all, anything excessive in our lives is unhealthy. When the need to feel safe becomes excessive, it can also become unhealthy. This is when paranoia can emerge. That's how we can explain paranoia.
So how can we tell the difference between paranoid thoughts and realistic worries? And also,
Yes,
is every anxious person also paranoid?
yes, how can we distinguish between anxious thoughts and paranoia? There's a particular situation when it comes to paranoia. Without having any concrete information, we tend to make extremely negative assumptions. As a result of these overly negative assumptions, our anxiety reaches its peak. And this negatively shapes both our quality of life and our behaviors. Let me explain with an example. Now, anxiety is actually something necessary for our lives. It's one of the things that keeps us alive. But with healthy anxiety, there is always clear information. Let's say you came to me and asked to borrow some money. All right? After I lend you this money, I might start to worry about whether I'll get the amount I gave back. What should I do in this situation? To manage my anxiety in a healthy way, I need to come and ask you, right? Like Zainab, I lend you this money, but when will you pay me back?
There is a need for clarity.
Yes. So this actually ties into what we call managing anxieties a bit here. But, I don't ask questions about the things that make me anxious. You asked for a loan, and I couldn't say no to you, so I gave you the money. This makes me feel insecure. But if I don't come and ask you about this, if I have questions in my mind about the process and start making assumptions like, we asked Zainab for a loan, we immediately gave her the money, but will she pay it back? Or when will she pay it back? Should I say something? I can't bring myself to say it. How is this going to reflect in my behavior? And so on. I need to clarify these things. For example, has she ever owed money to someone else before? What is Zainab's monthly income? If things like whether she can do this aren't clarified with information, in the end I can't answer these questions on my own. There is missing information. These are, things that go overboard. For example, your paranoia could shift to this. What if Zainab tells people around her that she easily borrowed money from me, and then they also ask me for money? If the situation evolves into other behaviors here, if something like Albert wouldn't say anything anyway comes up and so on. So we're talking about a simple but unhealthy thought process that aims to protect self-respect and self-identity by not lending money. Here, we create this fear with a lot of missing information.
Basically, imagining something that doesn't actually exist.
Exactly.
That
At its core, these kinds of things come up more often. Now, this is how we can distinguish between anxiety and paranoia. So, anxiety is a healthy thing, something that should exist, but being able to manage it is important.
yes.
If we can't manage it, it can turn into paranoia.
Okay.
Yes.
What can we do to cope with paranoia?
Now, to cope with paranoia, as we mentioned in the previous example, we can try to gather as much information as possible about the things that make us anxious. This could be about anything. For example, it could be about exam periods or about starting a new job. Let's say I'm about to start a new job. Now, I don't know what kind of environment is waiting for me there. But if I have an anxious disposition and I start thinking, what if I get bullied there? What kind of person is my manager, I wonder?
What if they don't like me?
Yes. What if they don't like me? What if they take advantage of me?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to be the newest and least experienced person there. What effect will this have on me? If I have thoughts like these, I would go to work feeling extremely anxious and uneasy, and this would reflect in my behavior. For example, how would it show? I might feel the need to observe all my new colleagues, maybe even to a degree that makes them uncomfortable. I would try to draw conclusions. But of course, making observations without proper information often leads us to make incorrect conclusions, especially if anxiety and paranoia are involved. That's why it's so important to know ourselves well. We need to truly understand how our brain and subconscious work. I see this a lot in people. For example, let me explain this to you again using the example of lending money. For instance, they think it's inappropriate to ask, when can you pay me back after lending money?
Yes.
So they can clarify the information, but they also can't get rid of that question mark in their mind. Now, if you can't get rid of it, that's actually a very important piece of information. And you can only get that information from one person, from the person you lend the money to.
Is it important to be open and clear?
Yes. In fact, open communication often protects us from paranoia as well. Because we get to know the other person more accurately, especially in communication. As you know, actions are much more important than words. In communication, emphasis, intonation, and body language make up 93% of it. If we can correctly interpret the other person's behavior, accurately analyze whether their actions align with their words, get to know the people around us better, and especially if we can say no and protect our self-respect. No matter how anxious we may be by nature, even though the likelihood of this turning into paranoia is high, we protect ourselves from it. Because in fact, we are usually the ones who decide which behaviors make us anxious or which ones turn into paranoia. We are the ones who shape this.
So what if the other person is someone who is closed off to open communication? For example, I lend someone money, I want to talk about it, but they don't respond.
Yes.
How can I protect myself?
How can you protect yourself? For example, one thing you can do is, if the other person is closed off to communication, you can take control of the process. For instance, let's say I borrowed money from you and I started to feel anxious. Then I came and asked you, Zeynep, I gave you that money, but when do you think you can pay it back? That's the kind of question I ask. Actually, this is a very well-intentioned question, because here you're leaving it up to the other person to decide how the process will proceed. This is a clear sign of goodwill. But even so, if the person in front of you is closed off to communication, you can take control of the process. For example, you can take more control, and instead of asking, when will you pay, you could do something like this. You could say, I want you to make the payment by this date. You don't really need to convince the other person about this. Like, because I have this payment to make and so on. Because I observe that people often resort to lying or exaggeration in this matter, then they end up putting themselves through a process that will make them feel guilty later on. None of this is necessary. Simply saying, I want you to pay your debt by this date is clear and straightforward. When we do it this way, the other person usually feels compelled to respond. In fact, we can even complete it like this. For example, I want you to pay by this date, okay? Something like that, the other person, yes, so it could be a question seeking confirmation, and we'll see if the answer is yes or no. For instance, we can be more assertive there. I mean, to be honest, I want you to have made the payment by that date. If we approach it a bit more from the emotional side, like saying our friendship is important to me, I don't want it to be harmed, it can be more persuasive. As I said, even if they're not willing to talk much or clarify things, it's actually very important to be able to analyze their body language there. But of course, this requires a bit of expertise. Don't worry, I'll teach you those things on this channel as well. Actually, it's not as complicated as you might think. So, at its core, how can we deal with our paranoias or anxieties? First, we need to know ourselves well again. And if we act in harmony with ourselves, for one thing, I often don't accept this. For example, clients come to me and say, I'm very anxious about this issue. I lent money to Zainab. When they say they're very anxious about getting the money back, I reject these anxieties. They might even do this or that, not pay me back. I've lent money to other people before as well. I can't say no. I always get taken advantage of by people. When I hear things like, my gentle nature is always exploited by people, I reject their anxieties and paranoia. Because there are things they can do to alleviate their anxiety in that situation. They just need to take action. That's why I don't accept their anxiety, because what matters is the behavior. In other words, the brain doesn't like stress and anxiety. It wants to get rid of it as soon as possible. In fact, it's actually trying to get you to take action. For example, as in this case, if I also have anxiety about being rejected by people or about the value you give me decreasing, it feels like anxiety is clashing with anxiety in our minds. Here, being able to manage this process is important. People who have such anxieties often realize when they confront their fears that the outcomes are not as frightening as they expected. But of course, it's necessary to be aware of how the process will unfold. By the way, the higher our paranoia or anxieties are, the more our ability to make healthy decisions is impaired.
Exactly.
Don't try to make decisions when you're anxious. Think with a calm mind, step away from the situation, distance yourself, and once you've calmed down, then think and make your decision. From what I've observed, people who act in a panic tend to make such poor decisions. And in communication, something is very important. In other words, don't put yourself in the wrong when you're actually right. Because at that point, a different dimension of communication opens up. It's important to be able to convey your anxiety to the other person accurately. That's why you should think calmly and usually decide how to act accordingly.
I've gotten answers my questions.
By the way, if you write your comments below about the anxieties you've experienced or the processes that have turned into paranoia, we'd like to stay in touch with you about those as well, frequently. We can talk about those too.
Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like.
Alright, see you in the next video.